I'm Ingrid Palmary, and I am with the African Centre for Migration and Society here at Wits. It's in the social sciences. And what I thought I would speak about today is why border controls make us less safe in South Africa. And it's a relatively controversial thing to say, but I also think it is true. And there are two reasons why I think it's true. The first is that migration policing in South Africa has become conflated with crime prevention, and it's been this way for many years. It's something that I first picked up when, excuse me, can I just get some water? I've got a frog in my throat. It's something that I first picked up when I first ever piece of research with police and was working in the area of community safety. And at that time we were working with the newly formed metropolitan police departments. And we did some surveys with them that were completely unrelated to this topic, but the thing that shocked us the most was that they were spending enormous amounts of their time, the time that they dedicate to crime prevention, arresting foreigners who had no documents. Now, at the moment, it's not that much of a surprise to us to hear that because we've seen it more and more over the years. Recent surveys suggest that it's exactly the same, and I think the logic of Operation Fearlet tells us that this is ongoing. But when we followed it up, what we found was that police were doing this because they believed that foreigners were primarily committing crime in South Africa, and that if they arrested foreigners, even if it was an arrest for not having documents, this in itself was a crime prevention activity. Now, there are a couple of problems with this logic. The first problem is an obvious one, which is that the evidence we had suggests that foreigners are not more likely to commit crime than South Africans. When I say this, people usually develop elaborate theories about how it's because foreigners are undocumented and so they sneak out the borders and then police don't find them, and that's completely implausible. The reality is that foreigners are a group in South Africa that are extensively targeted by the police, and that you can hold people who don't have documents for a very, very long time, actually longer than if they're suspected of committing a crime. And so it's very unlikely that foreigners are just not getting caught. The reality is that they're not committing crime any more or any less than South Africans. Now, if you think about it, this is information that's come up in other contexts as well. If you look, for example, in contexts like the US, where there's been a constant critique about the ways in which African American populations are targeted by police, you do find that then those groups are overrepresented in the prison population, for example. And the argument that's often put forward is that this is not because it's a group committing more crime, rather it's because it's a group that is more constantly harassed, if you like, by police. Now, given how much foreigners are targeted by police in South Africa, it's quite clear that we should be seeing higher rates of foreigners in prisons if they are indeed committing a crime. So we know that foreigners are not more likely to be committing crime. The second argument I often face when I put that forward is that, of course, it's a crime to be undocumented in itself. Technically, that's not completely true, but it is true that the police can arrest somebody for being undocumented. But herein lies the problem. In South Africa, we know we have very, very high rates of violent crime. I don't know the exact numbers this year, but we have around 20,000 homicides every year, right? This kind of crime can't be dealt with by arresting foreigners. It requires detective work, intelligence, and that's what we've heard from all the speakers so far. In fact, what we're doing is drawing police resources away from where they're most needed. And as citizens to whom the police are also accountable, every time we hear statistics that say how many foreigners have been arrested for being undocumented, I think that we should be quite upset about it, and we should be demanding to know why the police aren't spending their time arresting violent criminals and doing the kind of research and detective work that would allow them to do that rather than chasing people who don't have documents. Unfortunately, the extensive time that police are spending on this means that we're all more vulnerable. If we got to a point, hypothetically speaking, where in the future we found that foreigners in fact were committing large amounts of crime in South Africa, and this was a significantly risky population for South Africa, it would still make no sense to arrest people for not having documents in the way we're doing. And I'll tell you why with an analogy. We also know, for example, that most crime in South Africa is committed by young men between the ages of 15 to 25. No one would suggest, and it would feel bizarre, that what we should do about that is to arrest all young men between 15 and 25 and then sift through them to find out who the criminals are. And yet this is the logic we're using in the migration policing that we're doing at the moment. It's unlawful, it's unethical, but most importantly, it's highly ineffective policing. So my view is that if we continue to use this as a strategy, we're not going to make excuse me, progress in addressing violent crime. The second reason why the kind of migration policing, well, why border control makes us unsafe is that it increases dangerous forms of undocumented migration. So evidence from around the world suggests that stopping the movement of people is completely impossible. The United States hasn't managed to stop Mexicans going into the United States, and we're not going to manage to stop Zimbabweans coming into South Africa. This is not to suggest that border control doesn't make a difference, because it really does. What it does is result in more people crossing through illegal entry points using very dangerous methods. What that's done in many parts of the world, the Mediterranean is one example that we're seeing at the moment, but it's not that different to what we see on the Messina border in South Africa. What it's done is created a kind of business opportunity for gangs and traffickers and others who extort money in order to help people cross in contexts where they cannot do it alone. So, some of the research, for example, that we've been doing on the borders with children who cross borders has been very interesting in this regard, because if you look at the less policed borders, the ones where there's very little visible police, where the border is kind of somewhere over there, it's not very strictly monitored, what we see is young people crossing the border on their own every single day, back and forth, usually to make a phone call, to do some shopping, to visit a relative, sometimes to go to school. Border officials can't implement what the law says should happen with these children, because then they should go to children's court and social workers should get involved. These are children who have families who are going back all the time. What they tend to do is give the child a lecture about how they better come home before dark, and the children usually do because they were going to anyway, and the system works. With increased border control, this would stop. It would have to stop. And children would have to cross through the illegal entry points, usually in the bush. And that's really what you see if you compare, for example, what's happening at the Lubombo border post with what happens on the Messina border post. In Messina, where there's a high level of police visibility, strong controls on migration, it's a much, much more dangerous border for migrants. And those are the conditions that we will create if we continue to implement the forms of border control that we are implementing. And of course, the other consequence related to this is one that we feel much more directly across South African society, which is the increase in corruption. As there are fewer and fewer legal ways to cross borders, the bureaucrats who administer migration have more and more power over increasingly desperate populations. And South Africa anyway has a reputation for not dealing particularly well with corruption. It means that all people, even those who are completely entitled to documents, become unable to access them without bribes. And this is something we've already seen happening for many years in the asylum system, where really the details of your case are the least important thing in determining whether or not you actually access asylum. There are a whole range of other bureaucratic systems that you have to navigate. We also now are starting to see it in the critical skills visas, where we've seen recent changes to the ways in which what special skills and now critical skills are administered have made it more and more difficult, and that is going to create an environment in which corruption can flourish. So what would I do? I would create a much more pragmatic approach to migration based on two facts that we know about migration in this region. The first is that the majority of migration in Southern Africa is circular. In spite of what South Africans like to imagine, the whole world doesn't want to come and live in South Africa. And most of the movement in this region is people moving back and forth, right? This is not a dangerous form of migration. It's not a problematic form of migration, and we should simply allow those people to move back and forth and facilitate it. When that happens, what you do is have people moving through official borders posts with their passports being stamped. Then you have a degree of control, you have some information about them, and you know where they're going and when they need to leave. At the moment, we simply don't have that information. People are moving without that official kind of system of regulation. The second thing we know is that there are some forms of migration that are extremely positive for South Africa that we should be encouraging and facilitating. We should be welcoming people who want to come to Johannesburg to shop, and that's a huge group of African migrants in particular. We should also be welcoming people with critical skills who can contribute to growing an economy, and we should also be welcoming tourists. We're not doing that now. We're making it difficult for everybody, and we can't really afford to become more and more insular in the way we practice migration management. If we do these small things, then for me what we can do is focus our migration efforts on the kinds of migration that do pose a threat to South Africa. The drug smugglers, the human traffickers, etc. This is a very small proportion of the people who cross South Africa's borders. But as with all crime, as we've been talking about, this requires intelligence and good detective work. And closing the borders simply means that they can easily disappear among the thousands of other undocumented migrants who are not criminals. So that's my big idea.
Childline South Africa. My comment is for Ingrid. Ingrid, thank you so much for your presentation. Migration is something that's really close to my heart. I am a migrant as well, from Zimbabwe as well. But what I wanted to ask is, you talked about having done a research on child migration, and I wanted to find out, is it possible for you to share that research with us so that we can also see as an organization working with children, how we can also help affected child migrants?
Sure.
I think South Africa's had an experiment on migration control pre-1994. Apartheid is a system of control and exclude, and was managed and in pretty much the same way as the current system is, including how you practice employment and so on, passport, which is, etc. The current system that operates in South Africa has no fundamental around it. It's unclear who somebody's trying to protect with it. So systems of migration control are very effective ways of achieving significant wide-scale social exclusion of key groups of people and impacting and impeding their ability to actually integrate and develop effective communities and families. There's no rationale within this region to block the natural flow of people. And so this is a policy that needs to be really rethought through.
It's obstructing regional development, it's obstructing people's sort of developmental pathways, has no rationale, it's not being developed by people who have any big idea about what, in fact, development and what the needs of the country are. And they're not protecting anybody as well, they're just harming. So the system of control and exclude is also a philosophy and a mindset that can apply in other settings, including prisons. So the issue is that what you actually want to do is work out
what kind of society and social environment you want to have and design it along those, not with the mindset of finding work, confining and excluding. But I think that we have to really think it through. In South Africa, our policies are worse than those of Donald Trump. And I think that they are created for the same vicious reasons that he wants to create them in that society. And the question is, do you want to live in that society? And there is no evidence that it generates a good society.
I'm Koketo Mawasha from Mafefe Legal Advice Office in Limpopo. My question is to Ingrid. We need to harmonize the situation and come up with pilot projects for this issue, because what use is the border? What use is the border if we have children passing the border freely, coming back and forth? What use is the border? And yet we are all saying and we all agreeing that we have a problem with illegal drugs and illegal ammunition entering the country. What if that is the port? When at the time when you were at the actual port, you only saw children. What if at night that's the port for drug traffickers and human traffickers and all that? And who has to do something about this particular issue? And what use is the securities? Because the government or that particular committee is paying the security and everything at the border. What is their job, and why are we paying them with our tax money while we have another port which is uncontrolled?
So, I mean, I think You're quite right. There's absolutely some kinds of movement we don't want. My point is really that at the moment, there's nothing in what we're doing that's going to prevent or find guns, ammunition, any of those kinds of things. At the moment, what we're doing is largely harassing people who don't have documents. And that's not really the way to go about trying to find the people who are very problematic. And, you know, those things are problematic whether those guns come from within the border or from across a border, right? It's not really a border control issue. It's an issue of investigation and detective work and finding those kinds of syndicates. And I think the perfect example would have been the controversy around the birth certificates, unabridged birth certificates for children. It created a huge debate about, do we care about child safety versus do we care about tourism, as if those are the two positions. But the reality is that there was nothing in the implementation of that practice that made children safer. It was never going to be a solution, a system that made children safer. And in much the same way, what we're doing now with border control is never going to be the kind of practice that's going to find the drugs and the guns and so on. And so in some ways that would be my response. Yes, we need to prevent that kind of stuff. But what we're doing now is not doing that.
Good morning again. It's Nazo. For some reason, while we were outside, the lady was sitting with us. We were talking about the same issue that you are addressing. I don't have a mandate from the department to say what I'm saying, so I'll take it as a personal opinion. It's a career limiting statement for some reason. But I would really support the police in what you see it as a futile exercise. One, I'm tasked with the responsibility, amongst others, of coordinating foreign nationals and also addressing the scourge of illicit mining. And so far, if we look at illicit mining, the challenges that we get there, 95%, I know I'm going to be accused of being xenophobic. We've been accused as South Africans for that, and we're a loving country. 95% of those that are involved in illicit mining are foreign nationals, undocumented. And also, when you go around engaging with these small business or called spaza shop owners, I was asking a question, I repeated it again this morning. If you're saying as a man, you are seeking asylum, but you leave behind your wife and children, what kind of a man are you? What are your intentions? What are you looking for in that particular country? And you come in numbers as men. Are you really seeking asylum? Or are you here for a different purpose? In 2008, when I was deployed in Pretoria Central Cluster and Mamelodi Cluster, dealing with the foreign nationals that are doing business in a small scale. It started in Olive and Old Watch, where these different groups of foreign nationals doing business hired the South Africans, unemployed youth, to go and battle the opposing group or rivalry group, other shops. And then we had to dig deep into this, and we realized that there are monies that are stored in some houses, huge monies that are stored in some houses. And these are only men that are here with their wives left at home, and they are seeking asylum. And we are not profiling these people. But that mini profile that we made us to think of something bigger than asylum seeking, or even the spaza shops being used to fund something bigger that we don't even know what is it. So now the challenge would be, if we're saying the police should then focus on something else, and there are pockets of these foreign nationals that we know of that are involved in these criminal activities, how do we then say the police should do their work? And secondly, we have a Home Affairs department that is understaffed. The immigration unit, and also the inspectorate, that are supposed to address these issues. And for them to have operations, they rely on subs. So if the police are then not doing what they are currently doing, we're at danger of being at risk. Because not all foreign nationals, I agree, not all of them are criminals. But the vast majority that I've interacted with have criminal tendencies. I think.
I mean, my response to that would be to say that, I've heard this before, and I know that there's a suspicion of asylum seekers, particularly when it's predominantly men. This is something that we've heard a lot. So if you, as a police officer, are suspicious that there is something else going on, wouldn't the work, I don't know what that something is, but let's say it's drug dealing, right? I don't know what you thought was going on, but let's just say that for the sake of example. Wouldn't an operation to tackle drug dealing get the foreigners and the South Africans involved in drug dealing? To arrest someone for not having documents when you actually think they're a drug dealer is a very ineffective way to deal with the crime of drug dealing. And it's not very likely to be successful in the long run anyway in terms of prosecution. So it just seems to me that it's very unhelpful to say, well, we'll arrest them because they're foreigners rather than we'll arrest them because they're drug dealers. I would absolutely support you arresting anybody who's involved in illegal activities. I'm sure most of us would. It's just that finding them because they're foreigners is not arresting them because they're involved in illegal activities. So I guess that's my point, is that we're actually deflecting away from the focus on the crime, and if there's a suspicion of a crime, we should respond to that, whether it's no matter who's committing it. So that would be my response to that.